At 10:15 on the morning of August 17th, 1943, Adolf Galland stood on the railway platform at Rastenburg, the cool East Prussian air folding around him like a shroud. He had just left a conference with Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, an exhausting, circular clash of personalities and priorities that had resolved nothing, and now he stood watching the Reichsmarschall's luxurious train prepare to depart. The polished steel of the carriages reflected the muted sky, deceptively calm, hiding the storm that was gathering far above Germany. Somewhere in those clouds, American bombers were still flying. Somewhere behind them, something new, something dangerous was coming. Galland had not come to the platform for ceremony. He was there because he had run out of time. In his hands was intelligence so urgent, so transformative, that it could not wait for the next meeting or the next report. It had to be delivered now, before Göring stepped onto the train and vanished behind the armored doors of his self-assurance. Galland's boots clicked once on the platform as he closed the distance. If the Luftwaffe had any hope of surviving the next phase of the war, that hope rested on whether Göring would listen. The truth was simple and devastating. That morning, the Luftwaffe had intercepted one of the largest American raids, yet 2 heavy bomber strikes aimed at Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The engagement began like countless others. German fighters waited at the borders of the Reich. American P-47 Thunderbolts turned back when fuel ran low. The bombers pushed onward unescorted into the heart of Germany. This pattern had shaped every major daylight raid. It was predictable. It was exploitable. It was the foundation of the Luftwaffe's bomber interception strategy. But today, something impossible had happened. After the Thunderbolts turned back, after the Luftwaffe attacked the bomber formations deep inside German airspace, more American fighters, different fighters appeared. They came not at the border, not in the outer defenses, but 150 miles into the Reich. They came at altitude, diving with purpose, disciplined, coordinated. They came in numbers, and they fought. Every squadron that encountered them said the same thing. P-38 Lightnings, equipped with long-range drop tanks. With those tanks attached, the Americans had rewritten the map of the war. The Luftwaffe doctrine of waiting for escorts to peel away was no longer viable. The assumption that Germany's interior lay beyond the reach of American fighters had collapsed in a single morning, and with that collapse came the realization Galland had dreaded for months. The Americans were adapting faster than Germany's high command could accept. He approached Göring, the weight of the intelligence heavy in his voice. He described the sightings, the multiple independent confirmations, the combat reports from pilots he trusted with his life. He explained the range extension system the Americans had adopted, how the drop tanks allowed fighters to follow bombers deep into Germany. It was not speculation, it was fact. Fact delivered by men who had lived or died by its accuracy only hours earlier. Göring listened, at first in stiff silence, then with growing irritation. His jaw tightened, his voice sharpened. His face flushed with the familiar, dangerous shade that meant the conversation was drifting into forbidden territory where reality contradicted the image he needed to maintain. With a short, sharp gesture of dismissal, Göring declared that what Galland reported was impossible. American fighters did not have that range. They could not have penetrated central Germany. They could not have engaged so far inland. Any pilot claiming so must have misidentified the aircraft or mistaken gliding, damaged fighters for active escorts. Galland pushed again, firmly but respectfully. He explained the coordinated nature of the reports. He emphasized that the P-38 seconds had engaged in full combat capability, not the drifting descent of crippled aircraft. He laid out the tactical consequences. If the Americans could escort their bombers all the way to key industrial targets, the Luftwaffe's entire defense network would unravel. But Göring refused to hear it. It was not that he lacked intelligence. It was that he rejected unwanted intelligence. For Göring, accepting that American fighters had reached that depth of Germany meant acknowledging failures in production, planning, and doctrine failures he was unwilling to admit. To validate Galland's warning would be to accept that the Luftwaffe's strategic foundation had cracked. And so, he did what failing leaders often do when confronted with an uncomfortable truth. He denied it. Then he went further. He gave an order, a direct, unambiguous command from the Reichsmarschall himself. American fighters had not penetrated deep into Germany. The reports were mistaken, and from this point forward, the official position of the Luftwaffe would reflect that assertion. Galland understood the meaning instantly. This was not simply a refusal. It was a decree shaping the future of the air war. If the leadership insisted that a threat did not exist, then preparing for it would become impossible. Tactics would not change, training would not change, production priorities would not change, and the men who flew into combat, young, hopeful, trusting, would die because they were being ordered to fight an enemy that their own commanders refused to acknowledge. Witnesses would later recall the expression Galland wore at that moment, not anger, not fear, but a calm, almost tragic smile. A smile from a man who knew he had done everything he could, and that it would not be enough. "Orders are orders, sir," he said. Göring turned, ascending the steps into his luxurious train. The door closed. The whistle sounded. The engine hissed, and as the train began to move, Galland watched it fade down the tracks, carrying with it the last fragile chance Germany had to adjust before the storm broke. Behind him, the Luftwaffe's pilots were already taking off again, already fighting, already dying, and the American fighters Göring forbade him to acknowledge were already on their way. The train carrying Hermann Göring had barely disappeared down the tracks when the first wave of truth crashed over the Luftwaffe. It did not come from a report or an intelligence file. It came from the sky, burning, twisting, falling. By the time the sun set on August 17th, 1943, the day of Galland's warning, the Luftwaffe had already lost between 25 and 27 fighters. Many of them fell to the very threat Göring had refused to acknowledge. Long-range American P-38 seconds diving into combat deep inside Germany. The contradiction between Göring's denial and the brutal reality pilots faced could not have been sharper. It was not theory anymore. It was blood. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, twin strikes launched by the Americans with mathematical precision, revealed everything Galland had tried to explain on that railway platform. The bombers were supposed to be vulnerable once their escorts turned back. That was the doctrine carved into stone, drilled into German fighter squadrons, printed into operational planning. But the doctrine collapsed in a single morning. Instead of finding exposed bomber formations, German pilots found themselves ambushed by sleek, silver fighters that appeared from altitude as if summoned by the hand of fate. Pilots, who had survived dozens of engagements, were shot down before they could comprehend what had changed. The Americans had ceased playing by the rules Germany believed they followed, and German pilots paid for every assumption with their lives. 3 weeks later, on September 6th, the truth struck again, this time in the skies over Stuttgart. Major Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled bomber destroyers, led his unit into what should have been a familiar, well-rehearsed dance of death. Mayer had perfected the head-on attack against American bombers, a maneuver designed to strike at the fortress-like B-17 seconds where their defenses were weakest. He had taught it, refined it, trusted it, but on this mission, the pattern shattered. Mayer's squadron attacked from ahead, scoring hits, expecting the brief, brutal exchange they had mastered. Then the sky above them split open. P-38 seconds, waiting at altitude like predators in tall grass, plunged downward. The timing was perfect, too perfect to be chance. The escorts had been positioned behind and above the bombers, silent and unseen, waiting for the moment German fighters committed to their attack. Mayer's formation broke apart under the assault. 3 fighters fell in the first seconds. Mayer barely escaped, forcing his Messerschmitt into a desperate dive, using every ounce of skill and instinct he possessed to outrun the heavier P-38 behind him. He survived, but 5 of his men did not return. 3 killed, 2 captured. Not a single bomber confirmed destroyed. The mission was a failure in every sense, but worse than that, It was a signal. The old world was gone, and the new one was merciless. By October 1943, the pattern wasn't merely noticeable, it was screaming. Every major raid showed the same thing. American bombers flying deeper, staying longer, shielded by fighters that should not have been there, fighters Göring had declared could not exist. German squadrons launched attacks based on promises from their leadership, promises that escorts would turn back, promises that bombers would be vulnerable in certain zones, promises that the interior of the Reich was safe. Each promise was broken, and pilots died believing them. Then came October 14th, Black Thursday, a name whispered with a kind of reverence and sorrow, even decades later. On that single day, the Americans lost 60 bombers, a staggering number that shocked their own high command. It forced them to suspend deep raids for weeks, but the Luftwaffe's cost was equally devastating. 38 fighters destroyed, 42 pilots killed or wounded. It was the moment both sides learned the same truth, for different reasons. The battle for the skies over Germany was entering a new phase where survival itself was becoming a form of luck. 2 months later, the losses struck at the very heart of the Luftwaffe. On December 4th, 1943, Oberst Wilhelm Lemke, one of Germany's greatest aces with 131 kills, was shot down near Deventer by P-47 Thunderbolts of the 352nd Fighter Group. He was 23 years old. His death symbolized something larger than the loss of a single pilot. It signaled the disappearance of a generation of expertise, men forged over years of combat, men whose instincts could not be replaced by any training program. Lemke's death was not an anomaly. It was part of a steady drumbeat, a rhythm of loss echoing across every fighter wing in Germany. As the autumn deepened, Galland measured the damage not in anecdotes or impressions but in cold, relentless numbers. He compiled monthly loss reports from June to October, laying out the truth in a form even Göring could not dismiss without contradicting arithmetic itself. The losses climbed with mechanical consistency. June, 87 fighters. July, 106 fighters. August, 174 fighters. September, 193 fighters. October, 224 fighters. It was a graph of decline that no optimism could erase, but the numbers told only half the story. The real crisis lay in who was dying. In June, roughly 60% of pilots had more than 6 months of combat experience. By October, that number had dropped to 40%, and it was still falling. The Luftwaffe was losing its backbone, men who knew how to survive, how to teach, how to lead. Shooting down a bomber mattered less than losing the man who had flown for years, fought in hundreds of engagements, and knew precisely when to push forward and when to fall back. Germany still had aircraft. What it was losing was time, skill, and knowledge, currencies more precious than steel. Galland sent these reports up the chain of command, each memo more urgent than the last. He warned that within 6 months, if nothing changed, the fighter force would reach a critical breaking point. After that, losses would exceed the ability of the training pipeline to replace them. The fighter arm would enter an irreversible death spiral. He laid out solutions, improved training, increased fighter production, emergency tactics, accelerated deployment of the Me-262. He sent everything he could, and in return, he received silence. The Air Ministry issued orders to improve morale. Göring insisted that aggressive spirit would offset numerical inferiority, and month after month, pilots died fighting an enemy their leadership insisted shouldn't have been there in the first place. The losses did not break the Luftwaffe overnight. They broke it, piece by piece, pilot by pilot, mission by mission, truth by truth, denied. And the storm Galland had warned about was only beginning. By late 1943, Adolf Galland found himself living in 2 different wars. One was the war that raged in the sky, violent, unforgiving, scalded with fire and metal. The other was the war that raged inside the Luftwaffe's headquarters, a quieter but more poisonous conflict fought with reports, denials, and the steady erosion of truth. In the skies, facts were absolute. A pilot returning with bullet holes in his wings was fact. A bomber falling in flames was fact. A squadron returning with half its strength missing was fact. But on the ground, inside the polished corridors of command, facts had become negotiable. Galland refused to negotiate them. He had spent months gathering the truth, piece by piece loss reports, pilot testimonies, statistical analyses, fuel allocations, replacement numbers, and enemy tactics. His desk in Berlin became a mosaic of evidence, the paper trail of a crisis large enough to reshape the war. And he understood something that Göring and the Air Ministry seemed determined not to confront. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, not in dramatic collapses, not in sudden shocks, but in the relentless arithmetic of attrition. The data from June to October felt like reading an obituary written 1 month at a time. Losses rose every 30 days with mechanical certainty, as though Germany's fighter force were marching toward a cliff it could neither see nor avoid. 87 fighters lost in June, 106 inches July, 174 inches August, 193 inches September, 224 inches October. The numbers carried their own voice, a quiet, merciless whisper. This is what death looks like when it is measured rather than heard. But behind each rising total lay something far more alarming. The transformation of Germany's pilot corps. Galland saw it clearly in the experience distribution charts. In June, most pilots had flown for months, some for years. They understood the sky intimately, its tricks, its traps, its invisible rules. By October, that balance had flipped. The majority were now newcomers, young, hopeful, undertrained men shoved into cockpits because Germany had no one else left to send. Galland had once commanded a fighter arm filled with veterans forged in the crucible of the Battle of Britain, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Now he commanded lines of boys who had barely learned how to keep their aircraft level in cloud. Germany hadn't just lost pilots. It had lost time. It had lost memory. It had lost mastery. He tried to put this reality into words that Berlin could not ignore. His reports grew sharper, clearer, more urgent. Every page carried an implicit plea. We cannot continue like this. He explained that the fighter force stood on the brink of a breaking point so absolute that once crossed, no amount of willpower or courage could reverse it. In 6 months, he warned, the Luftwaffe would be incapable of matching losses with replacements. The enemy was outproducing Germany in aircraft, in fuel, in training hours, in everything that defined modern war. His warning was the professional equivalent of shouting into a storm, but the storm did not listen. Neither did Göring. Reports came back with short comments, attached phrases that sounded comforting but meant nothing. Morale must be strengthened. Aggressive spirit will offset numerical disadvantages. Improved tactical initiative is essential. It felt like watching a man treat a hemorrhage with encouragement. The crisis was not abstract. It was not theoretical. It was already claiming lives at a speed Germany could not sustain. And yet, the leadership insisted on treating it like bad weather, unpleasant, but temporary. Meanwhile, outside Berlin, the air war was transforming faster than anyone at headquarters seemed willing to admit. American fighter capability was expanding with frightening momentum. The long-range P-38 seconds Galland had tried to warn about in August were no longer an anomaly. They were becoming a constant. P-47 seconds appeared deeper into Germany with each passing month. And now, something even more dangerous was stirring, the emergence of a new fighter that would redefine everything Galland feared. The P-51 Mustang. At first, German analysts dismissed it. The early Mustangs with Allison engines were fast at low altitude but struggled in the high, thin air where American bombers flew. But the Americans had replaced the engine. They had married the Mustang's airframe to the British Merlin power plant, and suddenly, the P-51 was something altogether different, fast, agile, high-flying, and with the range to escort bombers to every industrial heart in Germany. Galland acquired performance data on the new version. He added it to his growing pile of warnings. And again, He tried to make Berlin see the truth. Germany was no longer fighting an air force. It was fighting an air system, a machine of training, production, logistics, and adaptation far larger than anything Germany could match. And that system had just gained its most formidable weapon yet. But Göring waved the threat aside. He told Galland the P-51 was simply another American fighter. He insisted German skill and tactical superiority would triumph. He insisted that what America had in quantity, Germany would compensate for through quality. It was a familiar refrain, and it was deadly, because quality was exactly what Germany was losing fastest. Galland knew this on a personal level, because the loss reports carried not just numbers but names. Some were men he had taught. Others were men he had flown beside. Many had been aces, instructors, encyclopedias of experience. Each one lost represented more than a cockpit suddenly empty. It represented the erasure of knowledge. A new pilot with 200 hours of training could not replace a veteran with 2,000. A capable novice could not replicate the instincts of a man who had survived the Eastern Front, North Africa, and the Channel. Germany was losing expertise at a speed that made recovery mathematically impossible, and so Galland kept writing. Every week he sent summaries. Every week he emphasized the same point. The Luftwaffe's doctrine was now based on assumptions that had been proven false. The enemy no longer turned back at predictable points. The enemy no longer respected the boundaries German planners believed in. The enemy was everywhere, escorted, aggressive, and multiplying, yet nothing changed. The dismissals continued. The silence thickened. Göring's denial hardened into an iron wall that no amount of evidence could penetrate. Galland was left with the truth he could not escape. The leadership of the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting the war it had. It was fighting the war it wished it still had. And every day that gap widened, German pilots paid for it with their lives. By December 1943, the war in the air felt like a tightening fist around Germany's throat. The P-38 had already shattered the old rules. The P-47 was appearing farther and farther inside the Reich. Every month, American presence in the sky seemed to swell like a rising tide. But nothing prepared the Luftwaffe for what came next. It arrived quietly, almost unannounced, as though the sky itself were holding its breath. And once it appeared, everything changed. The North American P-51 Mustang entered the air war over Germany like a blade sliding into a battlefield already covered in smoke. At first glance, it looked like just another American fighter, sleek, long nose, elegant in a way German designers secretly admired. But beneath its polished skin was something different, something decisive. The Mustang had been reborn. For 2 years, it existed only in supporting roles. A scout, a ground attack aircraft, a fast, low-altitude performer that simply could not operate in the high, icy altitudes where the American bomber fleets lived. German analysts, seeing the Allison engine versions, wrote it off as a non-threat to the strategic air war. Then the Americans made one of the most consequential decisions of the entire conflict. They took the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a masterpiece of supercharger engineering, capable of breathing powerfully at 30,000 feet, and fused it with the Mustang's aerodynamic frame. The transformation was instant, violent, revolutionary. When Galland received the first intelligence sheets comparing the P-51B's characteristics to those of the Bf-109 and Fu-190, he understood immediately what Germany was now facing. At high altitude, the Mustang matched the Bf-109 inches climb, exceeded it in speed, rivaled it in turn rate, and retained energy with frightening efficiency. It could dive like a stone and still recover with grace. And worst of all, it had a range that eclipsed anything in the German arsenal. With 2 drop tanks attached, it could escort bombers to any target in Germany: Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. Every city, every factory, every synthetic fuel plant. The sky that had once protected the heart of the Reich was now open, exposed, naked, vulnerable. Galland tried to communicate the magnitude of this shift to Göring. He brought combat reports, technical data, pilot testimonies, and his own analysis. He explained that the Mustang was a different kind of threat, not just fast, not just long range, but ideal for the type of high-altitude warfare the Americans were conducting. It meant that bombers would never again fly alone. It meant that German fighters could no longer select when and where to intercept. It meant that the Luftwaffe's last advantage timing had evaporated, but Göring responded with the familiar armor of denial. Another American fighter, he called it. Our pilots will outfly them. Our tactics will defeat them. Our experience will prevail. And Galland, hearing these words again, felt the same sinking sensation he had felt on that platform in August, the sensation of watching reality being dismissed because it was inconvenient. But the sky does not bend to comfort. On December 1st, 1943, the P-51 entered combat over Europe. The pilots of the 354th Fighter Group received their new aircraft only days before the first mission. Many had fewer than 5 hours in the cockpit. They had trained on P-39 Airacobras, notorious for spinning, unforgiving beasts that punished the inexperienced. The Mustang, by contrast, felt alive beneath the hands of its pilots. It responded eagerly, cleanly, almost joyfully, as if engineered not merely to fly but to belong in the sky. Their first missions tested them gently, a raid to Amiens, then one to Emden. But on December 13th, the Mustang announced itself with unmistakable clarity. 55 P-51 seconds escorted B-17 seconds to Kiel, 480 miles from England, deep inside the Reich, and returned home again. In the space of a single mission, they validated the decades of design, trial, error, and reinvention that had birthed them. They met German fighters over the target. They fought them. They shot down 6. They lost none. For the Americans, it was proof of concept. For the Germans, it was the arrival of a nightmare they had been told would never exist. Galland read the combat reports the way a doctor reads the charts of a patient slipping beyond reach. He saw the same trend he had been tracking for months accelerate with terrifying speed. The sky had become crowded not just with bombers, but with escorts above, below, behind, ahead. The airspace over Germany now belonged to fighters that could arrive anywhere, anytime. The implications were beyond operational, they were existential. As Galland prepared for a late December meeting with Göring, he organized his materials carefully. He needed clarity, facts, evidence. He brought performance comparisons between the P-51 and German fighters. He brought documentation showing how long-range escorts were eroding the Luftwaffe's kill ratios. He brought reports from squadrons overwhelmed by enemy fighters arriving where no escorts had ever been able to go before, and he delivered the truth plainly. The Mustang, combined with American production, training, and fuel reserves, would destroy the Luftwaffe unless Germany adapted. He proposed sweeping changes, accelerating fighter production, prioritizing the Me-262 jet as an interceptor, restructuring training despite fuel shortages, abandoning outdated tactics. He did not frame them as suggestions. They were lifelines, but Göring pushed them aside with a few curt sentences. Germany would win through courage, through skill, through determination. He dismissed the fear, dismissed the data, dismissed the threat. Galland left the meeting not defeated, but hollow. He knew now that the Luftwaffe's greatest danger was not the Mustang itself. It was the refusal of leadership to accept that the war had changed. And while Berlin clung to old beliefs, the Americans moved forward with relentless purpose. By the end of December, Mustangs escorted bombers to targets across central Germany. In January, they pushed deeper. In February, they appeared over Frankfurt, over Leipzig, over cities once considered untouchable. The long-range escort problem, the puzzle that had protected Germany for 2 years, was gone. What replaced it was a new reality, clear and unyielding. The Americans could reach anything. The Germans could stop nothing, and the sky itself had shifted allegiance. Galland understood this with brutal clarity. He saw the gathering storm that leadership refused to see, and as the new year approached, the weight of that knowledge settled upon him like a shadow he could not outrun. The Mustang had arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end. By early 1944, the skies over Europe no longer felt like a battlefield. They felt like a vast, grinding machine designed to wear the Luftwaffe down one pilot at a time. Every day the Americans arrived in greater numbers. Every day the escorts pushed deeper. Every day the Luftwaffe fought with less fuel, fewer veterans, and shrinking hope. And then, in February, the machine changed gears. The shift was brutal, unmistakable, and final. It came in the form of a single week, 6 days, that crushed whatever illusions of recovery the Luftwaffe still held. It began on February 20th, 1944. The Americans called it Operation Argument. The world would remember it as Big Week. The objective was chilling in its simplicity: destroy Germany's ability to produce aircraft and annihilate its fighter force in the process. Not weaken it, not degrade it, destroy it. The Americans understood that the Luftwaffe was the only shield Germany had left. Remove that shield, and the war would accelerate toward its end. Over 3,500 American bombers took part. They were not alone. Shadows followed them, P-47 seconds, P-38 seconds, and P-51 seconds escorts in such numbers that German pilots spoke of seeing fighters everywhere they looked. Above them, beside them, behind them, like the sky itself had learned to fight. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. Every squadron, every reserve, every pilot capable of climbing into a cockpit. For 6 days, from morning until night, the air became a furnace of engines, tracers, and falling wreckage. Veteran pilots flew 4, sometimes 5 sorties a day. New pilots, boys with barely 200 flight hours, were thrown into missions they were not ready for. Missions most would not survive. Galland watched the casualty lists arrive with an ache that settled deep into his bones. The numbers felt unreal, like reading the ledger of a disaster unfolding too quickly to comprehend. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed and another 180 damaged beyond immediate repair. That alone was catastrophic. But the pilot losses, those were the true wound. 100 killed, 90 wounded, 43 missing. Among the dead were the men Germany could least afford to lose: squadron leaders, instructors, aces whose instincts had been honed over years of survival. These were not just pilots, they were libraries. They carried the experience that young pilots depended on, the knowledge that textbooks and training flights could never replicate. And now they were gone. Major Egon Meyer, who had led the Stuttgart interception the previous autumn, fell on March 2nd. AP-47 caught him over France. He had 102 kills, 29 years old. His loss sent shockwaves through the entire fighter arm. 2 days earlier, on February 22nd, another Titan had fallen, Hauptmann Kurt Ubben, with 110 kills, 24 years old. Another irreplaceable pillar gone. These deaths were not just statistics. They were symptoms. They were warnings Galland had been sending since the summer of 1943, warnings that had been ignored or rationalized away. Now they had become graves. For Galland, the crisis of Big Week was not a surprise. It was the inevitable consequence of everything he had feared. He had been tracking pilot training hours for months, and the truth was appalling. A competent fighter pilot needed 6 months of dedicated training, a year to become good, 2 years to become exceptional. But Germany no longer had time, fuel, or safety to produce such men. In 1940 and 1941, training schools produced pilots with 400, 500 flight hours. By 1944, some graduates arrived at frontline squadrons with less than 200, some with 150. A few, tragically, with barely over 100, against American pilots who averaged over 450 hours before entering combat. The gap might as well have been an abyss. The new pilots could fly, but they could not fight, not with the instincts required to survive more than a handful of missions. And so they died. Quickly, predictably, sometimes within days of arrival. The average survival for a new German fighter pilot in early 1944 was 5 combat missions. 5. Galland understood immediately what this meant. The Luftwaffe was losing not just aircraft and pilots, it was losing the very ability to produce skilled aviators. The pipeline of competence had collapsed. Fuel rationing crippled training. Instructor losses crippled quality. Allied raids crippled airfields and schools. And through it all, Göring insisted that fighting spirit would overcome the crisis. Spirit does not replace skill, nor fuel, nor experience. The Americans recognized this weakness and exploited it with a ruthlessness that shook even veteran German commanders. When General James Doolittle took command of the U.S. 8th Air Force in January 1944, he transformed escort doctrine overnight. Fighters were no longer required to cling to bomber formations. They were unleashed. Their mission was now simple: kill the Luftwaffe. Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept across the sky ahead of bomber streams, hunting German fighters before they could even assemble. Other groups flew at low altitude, strafing German airfields with cold precision. Fighters taking off or landing died before they reached altitude. Returning pilots ran out of luck in the final minutes of their flight, shot down with empty fuel tanks, exhausted, unable to maneuver. There was no safety at any point in the mission. No window of refuge. The Americans had learned that to defeat Germany, they had to defeat the Luftwaffe, and they were doing exactly that. The culmination came on March 4th, 1944, the day the Americans struck Berlin with full fighter escort. Over 600 bombers, 174 Mustangs. The raid was not just an attack. It was a statement. The capital of the Reich, Göring City, the one he had promised would never be bombed, was now within reach of daylight bombers, protected from start to finish. The Mustangs shot down 16 German fighters. They lost only 4. Göring reportedly confided to his staff that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. But he said it quietly, privately, as if admitting guilt. To everyone else, he projected confidence. Lees layered over Daniel. Galland, meanwhile, could no longer tolerate silence. On April 27, 1944, he submitted a report bypassing Göring entirely, sending it directly to the High Command. It was not a report, it was an autopsy. In the last 4 months alone, the fighter arm had lost over 1,000 pilots. In the last 10 major operations, the Luftwaffe had lost 500 aircraft. American fighters outnumbered German fighters 6-1, sometimes 8-1. He wrote plainly that he would rather have 1 Me-262 jet than 5 Bf-109 seconds, a desperate plea for the only technology that might change the trajectory of the war. Fuel was collapsing. Training was collapsing. Experience was collapsing. And yet the orders from above remained unchanged. Fight harder. Believe more strongly. Fly with greater courage. But courage does not win a war when the sky itself has turned against you. Big Week had done more than damage. The Luftwaffe had broken its spine, and the Americans were only just beginning. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to nations. It belonged to numbers, numbers the Luftwaffe could not match, could not outrun, and could no longer even comprehend. Every month, the Americans increased their reach, their fuel reserves, their training hours, their industrial output. Every month, the Luftwaffe shrank further into exhaustion, but the collapse did not arrive suddenly. It arrived like a slow, grinding avalanche. One mission at a time, one pilot at a time, one truth at a time, until the last illusions of German air superiority dissolved into smoke. The breaking point began with a simple change, one decision made by a single man, General James Doolittle. When he took command of the U.S. 8th Air Force in January 1944, he gave an order that would reshape the air war completely. Fighter escorts were no longer required to stay close to the bombers. Instead, they were unleashed. They were free to do what American pilots had wanted to do for months: hunt. German pilots soon learned what that meant. It meant that from the moment they took off, Mustangs or Thunderbolts might already be circling overhead. It meant that, while assembling into formations, they could be bounced by fighters they never saw coming. It meant that even after surviving a fierce engagement with bombers, they might find an American patrol waiting for them on the way back. And if they managed to limp home, damaged, out of ammunition, low on fuel, they might still die within sight of their own airfield, shot down as they attempted to land. There was no safe phase of flight anymore. The Luftwaffe had entered a world where danger was constant, where the sky itself had turned predatory. And on March 4th, 1944, the Americans proved it in a way Germany would never forget. More than 600 bombers roared toward Berlin, escorted by 174 P-51 Mustangs. Berlin, the capital, the symbol, the beating heart of the Reich, the city Hermann Göring had promised, with booming confidence, would never feel the blow of American air power. Yet there they were. The Mustangs swept across the capital as if claiming it. 16 German fighters fell that day. Only 4 Mustangs did. When Göring saw the Mustangs over Berlin, he reportedly muttered to his staff, almost to himself, "The war is lost." But he said it privately, in a room where only the walls could hear him. To the rest of Germany, he spoke of spirit, resolve, unshakable will. But Galland knew the truth, and by April, he could no longer rely on Göring to act. He bypassed him completely. On April 27, 1944, Galland submitted a report directly to High Command, cold, factual, devastating. In the previous 10 major operations, the Luftwaffe had lost roughly 500 fighters and 400 pilots. In 4 months alone, more than 1,000 pilots had been killed, wounded, or captured. The enemy outnumbered German fighters 6-1, sometimes 8-1. He wrote the sentence that had lived inside him for months. "I would rather have one Me-260 2-inches action than 5 Bf 109 seconds. He knew the Me-262 jet, Germany's one true technological advantage, was being crippled by Hitler's insistence that it be used as a bomber. Galland argued, pleaded, insisted that it had to be deployed immediately as a fighter. It was the only aircraft fast enough to break through American escort screens, the only one that could choose when to fight and when to escape, the only one that could possibly alter the trajectory of the war. But time was gone, and denial was still in command. As spring turned into summer, the Luftwaffe continued to shrink. Training was collapsing under fuel shortages. Pilots with 150 flight hours were being thrown into battles against men with 500. Aircraft production increased, but aircraft without trained pilots were nothing more than metal shells. Ground crews lacked spare parts. Airfields were bombed repeatedly, and every day, the Americans grew stronger. Then came June 6th, 1944 D-Day. Luftflotte 3, responsible for defending France, had 481 operational aircraft on June 5th. On the morning of June 6th, the Luftwaffe launched only 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. Some Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches that morning later said they never saw a single German aircraft. Not one. The Luftwaffe was not absent by choice. It was absent because it no longer had the strength to appear. Only 2 German fighters attacked the beaches that day. Just 2. They were flown by Joseph Priller and his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk. 2 men whose courage carried them straight into the teeth of the largest invasion force in history. They skimmed the waves, strafed Sword Beach, pulled away, and returned home. It was a gesture more symbolic than strategic, a salute to a service that no longer had the strength to defend the land it served. The weeks after D-Day tore open any illusions that the Luftwaffe could still influence the war. Over 300 fighters were lost in June, more than 400 inches July, nearly 500 inches August. Factories were producing aircraft at record speed, more than 1,500 fighters per month by mid-1944, but it didn't matter. There was no fuel to train pilots, No instructors with enough experience left to teach. No veteran corps to stabilize the squadrons. Germany was producing aircraft for pilots who would not survive long enough to master them. Galland began receiving casualty lists, showing 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day. 50. Germany's flight schools graduated roughly 30 pilots per week. The math wasn't tragic, it was annihilating. Squadron leaders wrote despairing reports. New pilots couldn't maintain formation. They panicked when attacked. They lost sight of their wingmen. They made fatal mistakes in the chaos of combat. One commander wrote that receiving new pilots in 1944 felt like executing them, not because they lacked courage, but because no training system could prepare them for the sky the Americans now controlled. Galland tried everything. He pushed Me-262 production. He advocated for emergency training reforms. He begged for fuel allocations. He even flew unauthorized combat missions to understand firsthand what his men were facing. What he found in those missions broke something in him. The escorts were everywhere. The bombers were everywhere. The sky had become a place where German fighters were hunted as soon as they lifted their wheels from the ground. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper: squadrons with aircraft but no fuel, command structures with ranks but no leaders, bases reduced to smoldering dirt, and pilots who survived long enough only to witness the breaking of everything they had once believed possible. And above them, in every direction, the Mustangs circled. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer resembled the force that had once dominated European skies. On paper, it still existed, an impressive structure of wings, squadrons, groups, and commands. But paper was all it was. Reality looked far different. Empty fuel tanks, airfields cratered by bombs, aircraft without engines, engines without spare parts, and pilots whose confidence had withered under the constant shadow of the P-51. It was a military organism that remained alive only because it had not yet been allowed to die. And at the center of this unraveling was Adolf Galland, watching everything he had spent years building disintegrate faster than even he had feared. He had warned them for months, for years, that the crisis was coming. He had told them the training system would collapse. He had told them long-range escorts would destroy German air defense. He had told them the Me-262 was Germany's only chance. Yet each warning had been dismissed, minimized, or smothered beneath Göring's refusal to accept that the war had changed. By autumn, the gap between Galland's reality and Göring's fantasy had become unbearable. The final blow came on November 2nd, 1944, one of the most lopsided aerial battles of the war. Galland sent 500 fighters to intercept 975 American bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, 600 of them P-51 Mustangs. It was a storm of steel so vast that German pilots described the sky as blocked out. 98 German fighters were shot down. 78 pilots were killed. American losses were minimal: 50 aircraft, most of them to flak. It was no longer defeat. It was slaughter. When the reports reached Hitler and Göring, the response was rage, not at the disaster, but at the men trying to fight it. With the Ardennes offensive approaching, Hitler demanded that Galland prepare every available fighter unit to support the ground attack. It was an order that made no military sense. Galland knew the ground offensive had no chance of success, certainly not with the Luftwaffe in ruins. But obedience was no longer optional. Even disagreement had begun to resemble treason. The pressure built until it finally broke. In early January 1945, several senior fighter commanders gathered to confront Göring directly. They came to tell him the truth, that the air war was lost, that the pilots were dying for nothing, that the blame lay in leadership that had refused to listen. It was not Galland's idea, but he did not stop them, and that was enough. Göring erupted, accusing Galland of plotting a revolt, of conspiring to undermine him, of poisoning the fighter force with pessimism. Galland, who had spent years telling the truth no one wanted to hear, was suddenly labeled the problem instead of the messenger. On January 13th, Göring relieved him of command. The accusations came quickly. Sabotage, defeatism, disloyalty. There were whispers of a court-martial. The SS began gathering evidence. Himmler wanted a trial, perhaps worse. For the first time in the war, Galland felt something colder than fear. The realization that he might not survive the politics even if he survived the sky. But then, unexpectedly, someone intervened. Hitler. The Führer had always respected Galland as a combat pilot, even when he rejected his strategic advice. To arrest Germany's most famous ace, the man who had defended the Reich since 1939, would be a propaganda catastrophe. And so Hitler offered Galland a strange kind of salvation, one last command, one final chance to fight. Far away from Göring's reach, he would lead a new unit, a special unit, a jet unit. Jagdverband 44. The moment Galland heard the assignment, something inside him returned to life. The Me-262, Germany's jet fighter, the machine he had championed relentlessly, was everything he had claimed. Fast, deadly, untouchable in level flight. The one aircraft that could tear through American escort screens, strike the bombers at will, and escape before the Mustangs could react. If Germany had deployed it earlier, in greater numbers, with proper doctrine, perhaps the story would have been different, but time had run thin. All he had now were scraps of possibility. He took command with the resolve of a man who knew this was his final chapter. He chose his pilots carefully, men who had survived through instinct, skill, and luck. 10 holders of the Knight's Cross. Johannes Steinhoff with 170, 6 kills. Gerhard Barkhorn with 301, Heinz Behr with 220, men who had defied statistics, who had lived through battles where entire squadrons vanished. They were aces from another era, summoned for one last throw of the dice. Training on the Me-262 began in February and March 1945, as Allied armies closed in from east and west. The aircraft were magnificent, smooth, powerful, terrifying in their speed. The engines were fragile. The fuel was scarce. The airfields were bombed relentlessly. But when the jets lifted off, when their engines howled and their wings cut through the air like blades, every pilot felt it. The last spark of what German air power had once been. Galland flew his first jet combat mission on March 31st, 1945. He shot down a B-26 Marauder with a burst of 30mm cannon fire that tore the bomber apart. In the next 4 weeks, he added 6 more kills, all heavy bombers. His men scored dozens of victories, even as Allied aircraft circled their bases, waiting to strike during takeoffs and landings. The battles around jet airfields became violent duels of timing and desperation, jets sprinting into the sky, Mustangs diving to kill them before they gained speed, conventional German fighters scrambling to protect them, and yet none of it could change what was coming. Germany's cities were burning. Oil production had collapsed. Fuel shipments barely reached the front. Pilots flew missions knowing it might be their last, because the next day there might be no fuel left to fly at all. On April 26th, Galland flew his final mission. Leading 12 Me-262 seconds near Munich, he dove toward a formation of American bombers. As he adjusted his aim, a P-47 Thunderbolt piloted by Lieutenant James Finnegan struck him with a burst of .50 caliber fire. The rounds shredded his canopy, tore through his instrument panel, and ripped metal into his knee. The jet began to die beneath him. Galland coaxed it through a desperate dive, guiding the crippled aircraft back toward Munich-Riem with failing engines and ruined instruments. He crash-landed near the airfield, injured but alive. It was the last time he would ever fly in combat. 8 days later, Germany surrendered. The jet, the revolt, the warnings, the losses, they had all led to this quiet, inevitable end. Galland had fought to save a dying force. He had fought his enemies. He had fought his own leadership. And in the end, the sky he loved had become a graveyard of dreams that leadership refused to understand. He would live 50 more years, but something in him never stopped standing on that railway platform in 1943, holding the truth no one would hear. When Adolf Galland awoke in a field hospital after his crash in late April 1945, the war he had devoted his life to was already dying in pieces around him. Outside, the sound of artillery grew louder each day. The ground itself trembled with every advancing column. The Reich was collapsing not in dramatic speeches or sweeping gestures, but through the quiet surrender of cities, factories, and airfields that had once formed the foundation of its power. For the Luftwaffe, the collapse was even more complete because it had begun years earlier, in the sky, where every truth had been visible long before anyone on the ground had been willing to see it. Galland's final combat mission on April 26th had been the symbolic end of something much larger. Germany had no fuel left to fly more than a handful of sorties. Jagdverband 44, the elite jet unit formed from the remnants of Germany's most talented surviving pilots, had flown its last. The Me 262 seconds sat on airstrips like stranded animals, beautiful and deadly, but starved of the lifeblood that gave them meaning. The pilots who remained could only watch as the machines that might have changed the war were rendered useless by the collapse of everything around them. By early May, the front had swallowed everything. The Soviets were fighting through Berlin. The British and Americans had crossed the Rhine and were pouring into Germany from the west. Supply lines had vanished. Command structures had crumbled. Entire divisions disappeared without orders, without reports, without trace. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had become a ghost, a scattered memory of what it had been in 1939 and 1940. On May 8th, 1945, the war ended. There was no ceremony for the fighter pilots, no farewell for the men who had spent years living between life and death. Many were in prison camps, many were wounded. Many had died long before the final surrender. Galland himself was captured by American forces and transported into captivity. He carried no rank, no authority, no command, only the weight of everything he had tried to prevent and everything he had been forced to watch unfold. In the quiet months that followed, the chaos of war was replaced by a different kind of silence, the silence of reflection, the silence of hindsight, the silence of truths finally allowed to surface. Allied investigators interviewed Luftwaffe officers. Historians began gathering testimonies. Documents came to light. Reports written in frustration and urgency resurfaced in dusty piles of captured files, and slowly, a picture emerged, not of incompetence in the sky, but of fatal blindness at the top. Again and again, the interviews led back to the same moment. August 17th, 1943, the railway platform, the warning, the denial. What had seemed at the time like a single argument between a general and his superior now appeared as something far more consequential. It had been the turning point, the moment when adaptation could have begun, when Germany might have recognized the threat of long-range escorts, shifted production priorities, accelerated the Me 262 program, restructured training, and at least slowed the collapse that followed. But Göring had chosen denial, and the Luftwaffe had been forced to follow his denial straight into disaster. Historians found Galland's reports pages filled with numbers, charts, warnings, recommendations. They found the patterns he had documented with such precision: the rise in monthly losses, the collapse of pilot experience, the training hours cut in half and then in half again, the drain of fuel, the destruction of airfields, the emergence of American air superiority in layers so thick the Germans no longer knew where the next attack would come from. They found the transcripts of Göring's responses, dismissals, accusations, promises that Germany would prevail through spirit and willpower. They found orders issued to maintain morale rather than adapt tactics. They found decisions made not from reality, but from fear of acknowledging weakness. And they found the testimonies of surviving pilots, men who had flown into the sky believing American escorts could not reach certain altitudes or distances, only to be torn from the sky by fighters they had been told did not exist. Men who had been promised that bombers would be unescorted after certain points, only to discover Mustangs diving at them from above. Men who had trained in airfields constantly bombed, taught by instructors killed faster than they could be replaced, tasked with fighting enemies who outnumbered them on every axis from skill to speed to fuel to sheer volume. For them, the collapse had not been a surprise. It had been a slow, unrelenting truth, and Galland, he lived long enough to see the entire war retold, reanalyzed, re-examined. He became a consultant, an author, a historian of the very conflict he had once fought inside. In interviews, people asked him the question he had carried in his bones for decades: when did Germany lose the air war? He always gave the same answer: not 1944, when Big Week crushed the fighter arm; not 1943, when the Mustangs arrived; not even the Battle of Britain, when the first cracks appeared. He said Germany lost the air war the moment Göring refused to accept the truth Galland placed before him on that platform, when leadership chose comfort over reality, when pride silenced evidence, when ego overpowered strategy. He said Germany lost when the new American long-range fighters first appeared in August 1943 and the Luftwaffe leadership declared them impossible in order, not a fact. From that moment on, every pilot who flew into combat did so under a doctrine that no longer matched the world around them. And that mismatch, that refusal to adapt, had killed more German pilots than any Mustang, Thunderbolt, or Lightning ever had. Galland never asked for recognition. He never sought vindication, but history provided it anyway. His warnings had been correct. His predictions had been accurate. His fears had been justified, but accuracy had not been enough to save the men under his command. And that was the weight he carried, not the weight of being right, but the weight of knowing he had been right too early, at a time when the truth had no power. He lived until 1996. He died at age 83, far from the sound of engines, far from the smoke of burning fuel, far from the sky he had once tried to understand and protect. Yet in every retelling of the Luftwaffe's rise and fall, his name returned not as the man who commanded its last days, but as the man who saw the collapse coming long before anyone else. In the end, the story of Adolf Galland is not just a story of war. It is a story of warning unheeded, truth denied, and consequences paid in lives. It is a reminder that wars are not lost only in battles, but also in boardrooms, in meetings, in moments when leaders close their eyes to what is directly in front of them. And sometimes, everything that follows every loss, every death, every tragedy, begins with a single sentence on a railway platform, spoken into the wind: "Orders are orders, sir."